Hey readers, I'm Echo and I have a book buying problem. It's been a while since I've had any hauls here, and so this is some books that I've been accumulating over a few months now, but I wanted to just go through them very fast, and there's some very interesting sounding ones. But if something seems particularly interesting, tell me in the comments and I can do a little wrap up at the end of whatever next video I'm doing where I can go into some more details. First up, I got the new McCarthy. He's not up to his old tricks anymore. No, he's talking maths and physics and atomic bombs. It's very lucky to get an autographed edition. A friend of mine, he went to Powell's and he found a bunch of signed McCarthys. Now, it took a while for me to get this, so in the meantime I read an EPUB. So I don't think I'm going to open this out of its wrapper until I reread it, but very exciting, very cool to have some signed McCarthy on the shelf. And for the record, I really enjoyed the book too. It's really reminiscent of the type of reading I was interested in 10 years ago, before I got really into literature. A book I've bought a few months ago and that I've been taking down and sampling from time to time is Brut, or The Sighing Gardens by Friederike Mayröcker. It's put out by Northwestern University Press in a new series of avant-garde and modernism that looks pretty good. But this book is at least particularly interesting. Between this, the Divine Days reprint by Leon Forrest, and Matteo Caragiale, I think Northwestern is really killing it, so they're a press to look out for. Friederike Mayröcker passed a year and a half ago, and she was a very prominent Austrian poet, and she's known for poetry, prose, and sound works. She's written an elegy for her husband, reminiscent of Knox by Anne Carson, which seems really interesting too. But this is a prose work, a journal scrapbook-like thing with fragments of letters and newspapers, and it seems very interesting so far. And I've talked a bit to Sean over at Travel Through Stories about it, and he seems to think it's very good as well. Now, I also picked up Pigeons on the Grass by Wolfgang Koppen. This is the first book in his trilogy of failure. Now, it's a book that takes place in a single day and is formally inventive, so it has been compared to Ulysses. There are claims of Joycean language games and such, but it's always unfair, I feel, to compare anything to Ulysses, so I won't be too upset if it doesn't deliver on that promise. The book itself takes place a couple of years after the Second World War. It deals with the aftermath and sort of struggling to come to terms with their views on race. We have the perspective of a black soldier from the US, and we have the perspective of Germans, the psychology of having lost a war and the psychology of having perpetrated horrible acts. New Directions put out a new translation in paperback in 2021, so it should be available, and it seems very underread. I was met with confusion when it came out, but it's a solid piece of modernist writing that I think we're overdue to engage with. I'm very happy to pick up the stories of Dent and Welch. I really, really enjoyed In Youth is Pleasure last year, and now there's one or two novels and some journals to collect, and that's it. He started out as a painter and didn't really get to fiction writing until he was 21, and at 33 he died, so he did not leave a lot of work behind, sadly. But Welch was a supreme prose stylist with a very keen eye for finding and describing beauty. He would write about these mundane items that were a treasure to this young boy. Clearly not worth anything to a person in our situation, but he does such a good job of making a real treasure out of it. And also with how he describes people, there's an appreciation of beauty that's very aesthetic and very non-sexual, but it's probably from his beginnings as a painter that's given him this really unique way of describing things. I also picked up Giles Goat Boy by John Barth. It has a signed book plate in it, which was my main motivation. I do have the same edition already, but this one is in nicer condition, and with this I have both of his contenders for magnum opus signed, so I'm very pleased with that. For people unfamiliar with Barth, he is one of the famous postmodernists in the 60s, 70s, but his influence is much more limited now. You don't hear a lot of people read him, not a lot of new readers anyways. The Dalkey Archive reprinting some of his books will help with that. There's a very good article on LitHub called John Barth Serves a Wider Audience, which I will try to link in the description. It's a very good read and a sentiment that I share. A lot of people who haven't read his books have at least read his famous essay, The Literature of Exhaustion. And if you do seek that out, be sure to read the Literature of Replenishment as well, where he expands upon and explains some of the takes that were deemed particularly controversial. But yeah, if you like formal games, metafiction, intertextual hijinks, then check out John Barth. He is very enjoyable and fun, at the very least, and very, very smart. You can tell when you're reading his prose that it's a sharp mind spinning out those bars. But now, jump into something completely different. A dear friend of mine put me on to both Pierre Bergogneau and Pierre Michon as, in his opinion, two of the finest writers in French literature that there ever was. And having read the Bergogneau, I'm pleased to say that, that is some of the finest prose writing I've ever witnessed. And this is more of that. This edition of Small Lives, which was his debut novel, sadly out of print for the time being, but I think maybe Archipelago Books print some now and then as opposed to doing a whole new edition. The language does seem to be the most important thing here, and there's a very interesting article on Literary Matters about the translation process with Elizabeth Deshay. I'll link to that, and I have a feeling that I'll come back to this book in the near or far future. Next up is a book that I bought a very long time ago, but I've never talked about it, and I've now read it, and it's quite interesting. And it is Written Lives by Javier Marias. Marias passed late last year, but he has left us with many novels, and in this case, some rather fun observations and anecdotes on great writers. You get stories about Henry James and Ford Madox Ford, Oscar Wilde, Isak Dinesen, Juno Barnes, and more. This reprint edition also has an added section, collected some writings that he did later that fit with the style of this, where he writes about some women writers that I'm less familiar with than the ones described in the original portion of the book. But really enjoyed this Di Lampedusa story. Joyce I enjoyed a bit less, as I've read too much biography and I'm too familiar with the stories. But there's lots of gems in this, and it's not about their literature, it's about their persons, but there are people you know well, so it's actually a really good time. I also picked up Louis Aragon, The Adventures of Telemachus. It's structured on François Fenelon's book by the same name, and this is supposedly some proto-surrealist text, but also intertextual as it engages with at least 2 works. One of the main reasons I got this is because I love all texts that engage with Homeric myths, and this also seemed experimental in an exciting fashion. Truly just a good mix of a lot of different things that I love, and hopefully this brings it all together into an enjoyable package. I'm just sampling a little bit of the writing. The language seems fine as well, so I look forward to checking this out. I've also backed a couple of Tough Poets books. And if you're not familiar with Tough Poets, it's run by Rick Schober, who uses Kickstarter to try to gauge interest and try to get usually out of print and often forgotten pieces of literature that he finds interesting. He's reprinted stuff by Donald Newlove, Gil Orlovitz, Knut Thompson, Johnny Stanton's excellent Mangled Hands, Patricia Eakins. Yeah, many good examples. He also has made Alexander Theroux publish a lot of unpublished and collected stories. And the last volume was some non-fiction, I believe. It's all very, very neat stuff. Supporters also get acknowledged in the back of the books, with the exception of the Theroux books, I believe. But it's nice. You always see a lot of the same names over and over again, and there are many loyal fans of Rick's work, and it's really worth at least getting on his mailing list so that you get a heads up whenever he's putting out something new. A lot of these things you can also buy through Amazon, perhaps, but it's much better to get this info beforehand. Another interesting figure I've gotten to know through the internet recommended that I pick up Mambo Jumbo by Ishmael Reed. This will be my first read, but it seems very interesting. It's a book about the writing process, which is always interesting. There are pictures and snippets of other media here that I'm not quite sure what is yet, but it sounds very interesting, and there's lots of engagement with jazz and black culture of the 60s. A little sneak peek on Goodreads shows that John Keane himself has given this 5 stars, so very excited about this. It'll be interesting. Next up is a book called Inish by Bernard Scher. The very short description I found of this book said that it revolves musically around 3 separate identities and the idea of identity itself, and that Mr. Scher's novel can perhaps be best described as a metaphysical farce. This is a book that I've added to my TBR a very long time ago, and it's one I discovered by going to one of the people on Goodreads that I respect the taste of the most, and then ordering their reviews by number of stars. And this came up as a 5-star review. And the reviewer in this case was M.J. Nichols, a Scottish writer. And he says, "Imagine being trapped in the mind of an OCD amnesiac possessed by the spirit of James Joyce and Flann O'Brien. I imagine a book that uses such strange dwarf idioms again and again that the mind is forced into hilarity by proxy." Now, this doesn't tell you exactly what you're in for either, but it sounds very intriguing, and I'm very glad to have found a copy of it on Amazon. I picked up The Major Refutation by Pierre Zange. I love this man. Fragments of Lichtenberg is one of my favorite books. Not quite sure where to put it in the totality of things, but it was so funny, and I need to get to the other Zange's books that I have, and I'm very happy to add this to the pile. This one sounds a little rough to me, but it was recommended to me by a very good friend who has an exceptional taste in literature. It's Animalia by Jean-Baptiste Delamo. And it is more contemporary than the other books that I've shared today. It was written in, or first published in 2016. Apparently it won the Republic of Consciousness Prize in 2020, and everyone I know who has read it describe it as both brutal but beautiful writing. So we will see if it's something I can stomach. But I trust the people recommending it very much. Next up is signed book number 3. Quite something. When they announced the ultimate, and in that sense, I imagine, final reprint of Women and Men in a signed edition, I sort of regretted not ordering it last time when it was that edition in those blue little smaller volumes. And I hoped and expected it to be reprinted, but I'll take it anyways. It's very exciting to have a signed McElroy on my shelf, and that's not something that's ever going to be cheap to come by. At least nothing cheaper than this. Very excited to pick up Artful Sentences, Syntax as Style by Virginia Tuft. I think I enjoy Chris's videos over at Leaf by Leaf the most when he talks about either books about books or books about writing. And I have really been thinking a lot about what it is about language and literature that speaks to me. And I really want to try to figure it out and find out why some of my friends might love the same books as I do, but the sentences don't do anything for them, and the content doesn't do anything for me. So I kind of want to try to more concretely find out what prose does for readers like me, and probably many of you who are still watching at this point. I feel like finding that out would make it much easier to talk about books, and much easier to recommend books. I got Roberto Colosso's book on Kafka. Shoutouts to Dylan Reeds, who I hope to discuss more Colosso with at some point. I really admire Colosso's width of work. I really want to read his Baudelaire book. I really need to go more into his book on the Bible and all of those things. Ruins of Kosh. It's a particularly pleasant form of nonfiction, and I should get more into. I picked up Winter Journey by Jaume Cabré, and this sounds lovely. It's a collection of interconnected short stories, taking the form of a Schubertian progression in prose. Came out in 2000, so also quite recent. This is Catalan literature, which thankfully we are getting a steady stream of. There's a relatively new press called Fum de Stampa. It was founded in 2020 that is focusing on bringing Catalan language literature to English. And they have a large catalog already, and some of these titles sound very interesting. I have Summa Chaotica pre-ordered, but yeah, a lot of the others also sound very interesting. So we're lucky to have this press, so anyone interested should check them out on their webpage. I'll put the link in the description. They also have some nice discounted collections and subscription options. So, yeah. This wasn't the only book I picked up by the author, though. I also picked up Confessions, which is a brick. Very close to 1,000 pages, I believe. This was a huge success, and it's been translated to 20 languages, and it draws comparisons to The Name of the Rose and The Reader. So, I don't know, it'll be interesting to see, but I think I will dive into the short story work first. Little daunting to go in, but if the writing is of a quality, then we will tackle it. Next up is a book that I've been wanting to read for years, and it is my current read now. It's Adon, Buenos Aires by Leopoldo Marechal. This is another one of those compared to Ulysses, and while it is unfair, it's also understandable. I am loving this book. I don't think it's for everyone. I think it'll be a little exhausting for some, and by that I mean it's just so heavy with allusions and literary, political, all sorts of references. But hopefully I'll make a review of it. I won't say so much more here. I picked up the Trilogy by Jon Fosse. I read the first book in this in a library copy years ago. I didn't fall in love with it, but after having read Septology, I get it. So hopefully I'll have a better enjoyment of it this time around, because Fosse is really something. I picked up Peter Dimock's George Anderson Notes for a Love Song in Imperial Time, and there's also some friends of mine said was very, very good. It's a book all about human rights abuses and American foreign policy, and criticism of America's military engagements abroad. There's a really good review in the New York Times that I will link in the description if you're interested. It seems very interesting book, though. Here's a book I picked up half a year ago, I'd say, and I just haven't showed it off because it's not very pretty, but the more I look into it, I realize that the writing is pretty. Orpheus over at The Death as a Gang Boss has some beautiful Evelyn Scott books that I'm very jealous of, and hopefully maybe I can upgrade this copy at some point. I picked up a copy of Inland by Gerald Murnane. This is probably one of the biggest gaps in my reading, considering my taste. People have told me to read Murnane, and hopefully this will be it. This next book was brought to my attention by fellow booktuber Highway Patrolman. Ships of Fire by J.J. Armas Marcello. Apparently, Marcello was born on Las Palmas and Gran Canary Islands, and this was sort of like a Spanish attempt at magical realism. I read parts of it, didn't quite gel with me, but maybe I'll get back to it. Now, I picked up two books by Juan Jose Sayer. A person on Discord had gotten wind of my interest in Argentine literature and Latin American literature in general, and spoke very warmly about Sayer. So I picked up The Event and The Witness. And the more I read, it does sound like a good recommendation. He is seen as one of the most important Argentine writers. It's translated by award-winning Margaret Joel Costa. I've read her translations of Javier Marias and Fernando Pessoa, so that should be good. This was a bit of a gamble. The Lost Books of the Odyssey by Zachary Mason. And I don't know too much about Zachary or this book. I was just rolling the dice on a retelling of Homeric myths. But it seems fun. It starts with a fake introduction and everything. And a few of my friends on Goodreads have shelved it. Chris Villa being one of them. So yeah, hopefully this will be good, and who knows when I'll get to it. This will definitely be when the mood strikes kind of book, with no plan of reading it any particular time soon. And this is a little bit sad. I was very excited when I learned of Albert Vigor's Thelen, but less impressed when I was going to put this book away and I found that I already had a copy on my shelf, because I apparently discovered it in early 2019 as well. Well, it's better to have 2 copies than no copies, I suppose. It's a work that took a very long time to be translated into English, and now we definitely should get to it. Just to whet your appetites there, I'll give you a quote from Alan Goodman. "The Island of Second Sight is comparable in profundity as well as in complexity to Mann's own Magic Mountain. It is in a class with 2 other massive German masterpieces, Hermann Broch's The Death of Virgil and Robert Musil's The Man Without Qualities." So, that sounds exciting. Thankfully, approaching the end here. I picked up a second book by Joseph McElroy, A Smuggler's Bible. I have a couple of copies of Women and Men. I have Actors on a Stage, Love Plus. I have Heinz Kidnap. There's a couple of the big ones I really need, but I'm glad to be able to read a Smuggler's Bible. Been 2 years since I read any McElroy, and it's definitely about time that I start reading some more. I picked up Death by Water by Julieta Campos. I love Campos, and this is not available in English, and it's a very short book, very dense and difficult, I think, but it's fun to have, and hopefully I can work my way through it one of these days. Next up, I picked up the Anatomata by David Jones, which was a book that Orpheus was discussing as an interesting book. And this is, in some sense, an epic poem, but there are a lot of footnotes, and I've heard some people think that they're maybe more enjoyable than the poem itself. It's a dense and complex work, but it seems like it's something that will yield some pleasure to probably repeated rereadings. But yeah, we'll see. It was a rather impulsive buy, but from my little browsings within, it seems interesting, even if incomprehensible, which is, a me problem, not a book problem. I picked up The Bachelors by Henri de Montalon. Jeff Bursey, who has written some really fun novels, wrote that this was just an exquisite small novel that's affecting. And that's interesting and by itself, but it was just something that I was diving into French literature as inspired by my Algerian friend who's put me on to a lot of good books recently, and I figured that would be worth giving a shot. John Barth's On With the Story is a book that I already owned and have read and enjoyed, but I just got a free copy of it together with my signed copy of Giles Goat Boy. So I have a friend I need to visit and gift some of these nice surplus books. I watched Books You Haven't Read's wonderful video on experimental novels you should read, and one that I hadn't heard of was Dürrenmatt's The Assignment, but he made it sound like a lot of fun, even though maybe he doesn't recommend that everyone go read everything he ever wrote. But as an experiment, it sounded like a good time, so I'm going to give that a go. Go follow Nate over at Books You Haven't Read. He is fantastic at his job. I got The Wake by Margot Glantz. Margot is a Mexican writer whose family immigrated to Mexico from the Ukraine in the 1920s. And she has taught courses on Mexican and Latin American literature. And she's written quite a few books and a lot of essays and criticism. And it just sounded interesting. I haven't read too much Mexican literature. And I always seek out women writers that sound interesting. Now, Platz by John Treefry. This book sounds absolutely fascinating. If it can deliver on any of it, time will tell. But in the tradition of the prose form making of Michel Buteau, Platz is a masonry text built of modular narrative elements and settings, a textual city to be explored by the reader, wherein a single breath coexists dusty apartments and vacant beaches, reinvention and suicide, haunting and hiding, endless labor and crippling idleness, mint tea and storm waters. That just sounds fantastic. But I don't know what the book will look like. It'll be very exciting to figure it out. That one I will probably read this year. I got the Neo Avantgarde, a book on the Italian avant-garde, particular writers of the 1960s. I've browsed it quite a bit and it's very interesting, but the main takeaway from it is that Giorgio Manganelli is the guy to read, and I agree wholeheartedly. But I knew that, and I love Manganelli. But I will read this closer and see if I can find anything even remotely like Manganellian quality. Then we're set for some good reading. Did I talk about this before? Stones of Iron by Tim Robinson. It sounds fantastic. At any rate, there are NYRB editions of this and its sequel, so run and get it. Yeah, I'm just squeezing in Luis Goitisolo's massive brick in here. It's not news to anyone, but it was one of those books we waited for with bated breath all of 2022, and now it's here. I'm late to the party, but I just wanted to say that yes, it's on my shelf too. Maybe if somebody wants to read along, I'll get to it sooner than later. But that's it for now. Thank you to everyone who's watched, and if you made it this far, then hats off to you. Eternally grateful to engage with and talk to so many smart people because of this, and yeah, thank you, readers. Until next time.